I'm CNN tech reporter Claire Duffy.
Claire Duffy is here with us.
I cover artificial intelligence and other new technologies for a living. And even I sometimes get overwhelmed trying to keep up with it all and stay safe in the process. On the podcast, Terms of Service, we can explore how to experiment with these new tools without getting played by them. Listen to CNN's Terms of Service wherever you get your podcasts.
Funding for the Think podcast comes from Wise, an app for people using money around the globe. With the Wise account, you can send, spend, and receive in up to 40 currencies. You can download the Wise app or learn more at wise.com. Terms and conditions apply.
Not every guy can be the alpha male because hierarchies don't work that way. But some men might still want to project alpha vibes or might wish their sons would man up. And it turns out dudes can take lessons. From KERA in Dallas, this is Think. I'm Chris Boyd. More accurately, a growing number of camp-like programs scattered around the country position grueling fitness challenges and uncomfortable accommodations as incubators of manlier men. Men so strong that nobody dares to mess with them or even to question their position at the top of the social order. But as my guest will explain, actual alpha males in other species often display a radically different form of masculine confidence. Charles Bethea is a staff writer at The New Yorker, where you can read his article, The Camp's Promising to Turn You or Your Son into an Alpha Male. Charles, welcome to Think.
Thanks, Chris.
How do the people who claim to be alpha males or want to be alpha males define alpha males?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. It's one of those terms in the English language whose meaning has changed a lot over time. In the late 70s, there was this Dutch primatologist named Frans de Waal who needed a word to describe the male chimps in a group that he was studying in a Netherlands zoo. These chimps weren't necessarily the largest, but they were good at keeping the peace and consoling other chimps who were in need. And he wrote a book called Chimpanzee Politics, in which he described these chimps that were good at consoling one another and keeping the peace as alpha males. That was taken up by, among others, Newt Gingrich, who was then a congressman in Georgia. He hands out the book. As often happens in the English language, one thing starts to mean another. And you get men who are starting to actually think that rather than these sort of more nuanced, subtle attributes, alpha male is essentially the best at bullying.
The influencing of alpha males now has become a kind of cottage industry for some people. Tell us about Nick Adams.
Sure. So the way I kind of found my way into this story was sometime last year. I was on X, formerly known as Twitter, and I stumbled across this guy, Nick Adams. I don't know, why I was fed his content, but I was. And pretty soon I was kind of hooked on it. It was sort of like watching a car crash, for me at least. He was this guy who was telling men to never apologize. He had about 600,000 followers, by the way. He was telling men, don't apologize, find a woman who is as, and I quote, hot as she is low maintenance. He had a bunch of commandments. He actually had 45 of them that he included in a book that he wrote. And that was called Alpha Kings, came out 2 years ago. Donald Trump, our president, wrote the foreword to this book, or is credited with writing the foreword to the book. And, it was this slim sort of advisory manual, if you will, that was telling mostly young men. It said it was for men between the ages of something like 15 and 35, telling them how to become a quote unquote alpha male as Nick Adams conceived of it. And Adams was doing most of his lecturing on Twitter or X, but he also would appear before groups of mostly conservative young men in DC and elsewhere to sort of describe the virtues of this kind of alpha masculinity.
It does take a certain kind of ego to craft 4.5 times as many commandments as God thought he needed.
I hadn't thought of that. Yeah, I mean the 45 I interpreted to be a reference to Donald Trump, the 45th president, who wrote the foreword. But who knows?
Well, and Nick Adams was selected first to be U.S. ambassador to Malaysia. That sort of fell apart. And now he is the new special envoy for American tourism, exceptionalism, and values. Is it reasonable to see the selection of someone like Nick Adams as a deliberate provocation on the president's part?
Yeah, I think we know that the president enjoys trolling, especially the libs, as we call them. And this certainly would fall into the category of an excellent trolling move. But I think it's also something larger than that. It fits too within the sort of the cabinet that he's chosen and the people outside of his cabinet, the people he's put in places of power. You've got Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's may not describe himself as an alpha male, but sort of has the window dressing of one with his shirtless bench pressing videos he puts online. We see Pete Hegseth attempting or I should, doing pull-ups, sometimes not perfectly, but doing pull-ups and videos. And we see Kash Patel, taking FBI agents to UFC training camp. So the Nick Adams thing, while he's a smaller sort of power player in this broader administration, it fits the other kinds of choices that Donald Trump has made. And so we can presume, I did an interview Trump for the piece, that this sort of alpha masculinity, as it's now conceived of in modern times, is important to him.
I mean, certainly Nick Adams has implied that of all the alpha males down through history, Donald Trump is like the alphiest. But I think what's interesting is that the president doesn't actually fit the stereotype perfectly when it comes to, say, demonstrations of physical strength. Maybe he makes up for that in his tendency to make demands and never take no for an answer.
I don't know. His doctor said he was, the greatest physical specimen he'd ever encountered.
Fair enough. Okay.
So I'm obviously joking, but yes, I take your point. Donald Trump plays golf. I don't know if he does a lot of other sports, but he does exude the sort of I'm the loudest, most powerful final word in any given room.
How has the online and podcast space known as the manosphere organized itself around the perceived superiority of an alpha male lifestyle?
The internet sort of, as we know, takes off in the early 2000s, and there's this new place for hypermasculinity to incubate. And hypermasculinity, we should note, is something that's been around for a long time. It goes back to Teddy Roosevelt and before. We have these kind of recurring periods of hypermasculinity in American history that tend to come on the heels of rights given to women or minorities or any group that may be perceived to be chipping away at the power of men, right? So in the early 2000s, we have the internet comes online, and we get blogs, we get podcasts eventually, we get shows on YouTube, we get people like Joe Rogan, who becomes kind of the most broadly palatable, I would say, flag bearer of the manosphere. And then you also get these guys like the Andrew Tates and the Wes Watsons, and our listeners may not know exactly who they are, but they may have heard of them. There are these, I would say, much more toxic versions of this kind of alpha male ideal. They're pretty open about demeaning women, taking power from women, etc. And so they're part of the sort of fringes of the manosphere. The pandemic comes around, and the lockdown brings more eyeballs to screens and to this kind of content, which is also added to Donald Trump's rise. And the sort of the wrongs that are were spoken about around that time that men were doing, the sort of the view that men were actually responsible for a lot of bad things, and the fixation on that, I think, turns a lot of men off, perhaps understandably, and drives them to this kind of manospheric content. And that creates a culture ripe for sort of entrepreneurial solutions. I'll put that in quotes, to the problem of quote unquote weak men. And that's where we start to see some of the camps that I wrote about.
We will definitely talk about those camps. I do want to talk about the fact, though, that the rise of the current iteration of alpha male did not have to play out this way. I mean, tell us about the Alpha M YouTube channel that was started in 2008.
Yeah, so this guy, Aaron Marino, lives outside of Atlanta. He's in his early 30s at the time. He is out of work. He doesn't have much money, but his wife has given him as a gift a camcorder, and he uses it to, as he described to me, help give men advice and a role model, the kind of thing that he told me he didn't have when he was a young man. And he does, I'd say, mostly positive things. Some of them are a bit funny, and you might chuckle or roll your eyes when he's talking about, approaches to dealing with butt hair or dealing with erectile dysfunction. He's trying to help men in the ways that he knows how, by offering them solutions through videos that he posts online. He says that for him, alpha male it's the best version of yourself, the best version of a given man. And he gets something like 25 million independent visits to his page per month, coming up through the late 2018-19 sort of period. He's doing very well, and he doesn't. I didn't look at every video he ever posted, but I would, from the ones that I saw, I would say he doesn't abuse the power that he has. He continues to give mostly, I think, broadly acceptably good advice to men about confidence, about dressing, about hygiene, about how to approach women in generally respectable ways. And then the pandemic arrives, and for the reasons that some of which I just described, men start leaving Aaron Marino and pages similar to his on YouTube and elsewhere, and going instead to these much louder, more toxic voices like Andrew Tate and Wes Watson, who are receptive to the kind of anger that men are feeling.
It does feel like there's a lot of alpha male energy in the tech space now, right? Like Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk once probably coded like skinny and nerdy, and now their personal brands are all about looking hyper masculine and pretty jacked, as if to be a successful man now you have to show off muscle along with money.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there was a moment a few years back, right, when Zuckerberg had become a cage fighter, and he was challenging Elon Musk to a fight in the cage. And I think a lot of people wanted to see that happen. Maybe people who didn't love those two guys, but yeah, it's interesting to see men who've been very successful in certain ways, financially, other kinds of power, decide that they need to have that physicality as well, which has always, I think, been close to any conception of what an alpha male is.
You also note that, some men are doing something now in pursuit of alpha male appearances that we used to associate with vain women, and that is plastic surgery.
Yeah, and this wasn't, a great big focus of my piece, but I did note it because it does feel like it's part of this broader move to create a man who, with the bulging biceps, with the strong chin, maybe with a little work done beneath his underwear. All these kinds of things that are really, ultimately superficial changes to a man, to his appearance. But right now, there's a lot being offered online, in particular, to satisfy these kinds of needs, and men are going and doing these things. And I would say, just to put my thumb on the scale, and we can talk more about it, like, these are obviously not the kinds of things that are ultimately going to be healing any kinds of real traumas or challenges with confidence. But if you have the money, it's an easy sort of quick quote unquote fix.
I mean, we can't say everything about anyone, but does every guy want to be an alpha male in the United States these days?
I'm not sure even that most men who are drawn to this kind of stuff even like the phrase alpha male. I think it's sort of started to turn a little sour because of the Andrew Tates of the world. Some men, are willing to draw a line somewhere prior to the Tate version of alpha masculinity, and they just prefer not to even use the term and instead lean into other terms, some of which I describe in the story as, warrior kings and king, warrior, other sorts of, royal, regal, battle hardened sort of terminology to describe the kind of man that they want to be. And I guess I would agree with you, or the premise of your question, that many men, for various reasons, do like the idea of having some sort of inner warrior in them. I'm not opposed to it myself, but it's more about how do you get there and what does that mean?
All right, Charles, for any man who maybe feels like they don't have this all going on naturally, you discovered a whole array of special programs designed to help them. Tell us about the assortment of camps and weekends and encounters that you found.
Yeah, so once I began following that fellow Nick Adams that I described earlier, I started getting fed content, more content. The algorithm was feeding me stuff related to alpha masculinity, including these kind of programs and camps that I wrote about. And so this was something that, other men found these camps other ways. They would some of these guys that I ended up talking to for the story would go online and they would describe how they felt, weak, lonely, without purpose. Maybe they would use the word beta, the opposite of alpha, and out for them would pop out links to things like Warrior Week and Men of War Crucible, Rise Up Kings, and one that I visited called RISE, which is an acronym standing for Ruthless Integrity and Simple Execution. And I also visited another, which was geared more towards young men, teenagers, called the Squire Program.
Broadly speaking, what do these programs tend to consist of?
Well, they consist, it turns out, of kind of a range of things, but the advertising, the marketing is pretty consistent across the board. You almost always, when you log on to their websites, you see, men rolling around in the mud carrying heavy objects. You see almost always all caps text beneath these images that could be pulled from, some action adventure movie, and the words say things like build courage, earn certainty, become elite. Occasionally, alpha is thrown in. The dreaded beta is also incorporated into the marketing material. And so they don't they don't actually tell you often a lot about what's going to happen, but with these images and with these words, these sort of broad brushstrokes, words and images, you as the viewer, as the man who's ready and open to this kind of stuff, can conjure up a sort of alpha version of yourself.
So none of the ones that you write about last long enough to truly transform anyone's physique. So I suppose ultimately the goal here is really psychological.
I think they're trying to kickstart the physical stuff, but yes, the goal is definitely psychological, and I think it's 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 done in different ways and with different degrees, I would say, of care at different camps, and we can talk about each of the two that I observed.
Well, let's talk about Rise. I mean, a lot of these places that you contacted did not want to invite you to come and observe. This group said, fine. Do you have any idea why they said, yeah? I mean, it seems to me that, I mean, I don't know that a lot of alpha males are reading the New Yorker every week, but it is free publicity.
Hey now, hey now.
So why would anybody say no to you, do you think?
Well, I mean, it's not a great surprise that there's a distrust in the media, especially the quote unquote liberal leftist media. Our president has done some things to seed that distrust. The media itself has made mistakes too, surely, but the New Yorker is one of those magazines that leans to the left a little bit, and these camps almost always lean to the right. And so there's a natural lack of trust there. There's a sense that the writer won't be good faith. And I think some other observers who've written stories for other outlets over the years haven't treated their subjects with the kind of respect that they do deserve.
Rise was founded by a former Marine turned motivational speaker and mental health professional named Brendan King. That alone is such an interesting resume. What is his story, and why did he decide this service was something the world needed and he could provide?
Yeah, so Brendan King, he's in his early 50s. He has kind of a chaotic childhood full of trauma, some of which he described to me, but it leads him to, in his mid to late teens, attempt suicide by running into traffic. Fortunately, he was not killed. He survived that. He goes on to, rather than go to therapy or try, I don't know, antidepressants or something, he enlists in the Marines. And as he described it to me, that was his attempt to become an alpha male. And I think that the Marine Corps and kind of the costumery and the idea we have of the Marine and what they go through at boot camp is very much suffused in not just Rise, but a lot of these other camps. It's kind of the quintessential alpha male in a lot of ways. So he tries that. He gets married at some point after coming out of the Marines, and he, by his own description, destroys that marriage because he's just a really toxic version of an alpha male. And he comes out of that and into his second marriage, realizing, yes, he wants to hold on to some of what the Marine version of an alpha male is, but he also wants to infuse in that what he would later admit to me is some of the better qualities of the beta. So he's doing something that's ultimately kind of a hybrid camp. But the men who attend, I think, go into it thinking that seeing all the stuff on his website, on the Rise website, where the men are rolling around doing obstacle courses in the mud, I don't think that they anticipate fully the complexity of his approach and the ways that he's doing some things that I think are similar to a kind of therapy. So King is doing something a little more nuanced than what we see at places like Warrior Week and Men of War Crucible. But when I show up, the first few activities they do fall very squarely within that kind of classic, boot camp sort of version of all this. And I can describe some of that if you'd like.
Yeah, for one thing, they have to be blindfolded on their way to the first location, right?
Yeah, they're so I don't know how many of your listeners are familiar with the film Old School with Will Ferrell, but there's a moment in that movie where Will Ferrell and others who take part in a fraternity ritual and they're hazed and they're blindfolded and thrown into a van. And that's exactly how this whole thing began at Rise. I'm in a parking lot. I'm stationed in a distance from these guys who are lined up on the curb. I knew they were going to be there. And then suddenly these two vans pull up, screech to a halt. These military, these former Marines and police officer guys who worked for King throw these 10 men into the van, blindfold them, and then it's off to an unknown location in the woods. And so I'm thinking like, all right, wow, it's almost eye rolling how it feels like it's the movie version or the satirical version
Like a
of
little
what
theatrical. Yeah.
it's very theatrical. And but tried to reserve judgment and followed them in my vehicle as they headed about 45 minutes outside of Charlottesville to a property that King owns in the woods.
And Rise promises full spectrum transformation for participants. How does that transformation begin when they first arrive there?
So in the van on the way there, there's Jordan Peterson lectures are playing. It's this kind of mashup of Peterson and Dave Goggins and construction sounds. And the whole point, as King described it to me later, is to separate the men from the lives they were coming from and the experience they were about to have. So they get out of the van. They're allowed to take off their blindfolds. They line up according to height, and one by one, they each walk over to an area beside this steep driveway. And King has sort of a powwow with each of them where he tries to elicit from them the reasons they're there, the kind of men that they are, and the kind of men that they want to become. And from there, they begin a low crawl, again, the military stuff, up this steep gravel driveway in the heat. It's August in Virginia. And these guys, a lot of them are pretty overweight. It's quite hard for them, probably would be for anybody. And in the middle of it, a couple of them just start bitching and moaning. And King orders them to stop. And then he fixes his gaze on one of the guys, this guy named James. And I can describe to you kind of the scene that unfolded from there. But that was the first moment when I was like, oh, this isn't just a military boot camp. There's some actual sort of potentially helpful, potentially dangerous psychological sort of work going on here.
Yeah, talk more about that, Charles, because I was not expecting this in the middle of your article.
Yeah, so they stop the low crawl, and I'm standing there 20 feet away with one of these coaches, and we're watching. And King just says something to the effect of, "Who here is not having sex with his wife?" And he knew that at least one of the men had intimacy issues with his wife, because prior to arriving in Virginia, the men had answered questions that he would send them. They would do like, I don't know, 2 minutes a day of this sort of audio journaling, if you will, using prompts from King, which are meant to elicit kind of the stuff that they're trying to break free from. And so, in the middle of this low crawl, King starts drawing from his notes and his memories of some of that stuff, because the men, and this is the theory here, the men have been sort of made vulnerable by the physical exertion. They're sort of opened up, And so he fixes his gaze, as I said, on this guy named James, who turns out does have intimacy issues with his wife, and in fact has, as he almost immediately admits to the group, he has erectile dysfunction, and he's having to use all these remedies and these needles, and it's very intimate stuff. It's very embarrassing stuff that he's never apparently admitted to anyone. And so I'm watching as he's sweating there, lying on the ground, admitting to a group of relative strangers and a journalist that he has ED. And this is one of the things that he's trying to work through in order to become a more empowered man.
I mean, how did the other men in the group respond when this particular individual opened up? I mean, did they act the way we might imagine other alpha males would act, or how did they respond?
I don't know, obviously I wasn't inside their heads, but I did hear out loud a few of them ultimately say something to the effect of, I've experienced something like that too. Like not exactly fully signing on to the stuff that James was doing to deal with his problem, but essentially giving him some empathy, hearing him, acknowledging him. And King too chimed in, Brendan King, the director of the whole program, and said, when I was younger, I had something like that happen to me too. So hearing each other was a big part of a big and I think clearly positive part of the program, to the degree we can separate the clearly good from the maybe good from the maybe bad. Listening to one another was starting to happen. It seemed like from the get go, because I'm sure these guys were startled that one of the men among them was able to open up and start crying. In fact, and it was not the first or last tears that I saw that weekend from guys who, safe to say, were not crying in front of other men very often, if ever.
So talk, Charles, the idea that there's, whatever, this physical hardship and it primes some men to be more vulnerable and maybe, have some emotional intimacy with other men, that part seems okay. What about this made you concerned that it may not be all good?
Well, I want to say that Brendan King, I came to know him pretty well, and I respect what he's trying to do, and I appreciate the success that it seems like he's had, according to the interviews I've done. Not with every man, but with some of the men who have left the program and continued to stay in touch with one another and build a kind of brotherhood that I think can function as a kind of therapy outside of the normal therapeutic environment, which a lot of men are scared of or turned off by. But King does not have the licenses that therapists have. He hasn't done the training. He's done some things. He's not just a Marine guy. He's done some work with substance abuse because he himself had some problems there. He's done some anyways, he's done some other stuff related to police work, et cetera, but he's not a licensed therapist, right? So these men are very vulnerable at certain points during this program, and he's just kind of jumping in there and doing what he thinks will work. But I think it's fair to be skeptical of someone just sort of without a lot of academic or other instructional kind of background jumping in there and playing with volatile emotions. Again, I think his intention is good, but it's a matter of, is this going to work?
And there are also programs that are specifically set up for young people, for teenagers, sometimes with their dads. Talk about that.
Yeah, no, this one I think was more of what I expected to find. I tried again to remain very open-minded throughout all these trips that I took to these programs, but this one, the Squire program, uh, it's been around for just a couple of years, like Rise. Unlike Rise, it caters to boys between the ages of 12 and 17, along with their fathers. So the fathers and sons come together. It took place over the course of a single day rather than a long weekend. And it also involved a manosphere influencer, which King is really not. This influencer who runs Squire is named Bedros Keuilian. He's an Armenian immigrant in his 50s who described to me and says this elsewhere, many other places online. He has a communist father who was a physical disciplinarian, but who had this sort of broke mindset that Julian sets up as this thing that he was trying to overcome in his own tough teenage years prior to his ultimately becoming an entrepreneur, founding the Fit Body Bootcamp franchise, writing a book called Man Up. He's not an Andrew Tate, to be clear. He's a warm guy. He's kind of got this Papa Bear thing, but he does traffic in what I would describe as some toxic material.
So, do these boys want to be there?
It's hard to know if the teenage boys were all leveling with me when I asked them, some of them, that question, but a few of them did say, they sort of shrugged and were like, I'm just here because he wants me to be, gesturing over at dad. A couple of them seemed to be having fun. Others, as I described in the piece, seemed more like hostages. But it was something that they had, whether they had been pulled into the car and driven there against their will, or, set their alarm and gotten up early, they were all there for about 12 or 13 hours of an interesting day with dad.
Charles, we should say there is a pretty long history in this country of anxiety about declining masculinity among American men. What did you learn about that?
Yeah, so the alpha male phenomenon belongs to this sort of recurring history of hypermasculinity, which has been this kind of predictable response to the perceived threats of feminization. So in the late 19th, early 20th century, women begin to enter the workforce in greater numbers. Men are told to take what's called the West Cure. It's basically a prescription for the cowboy lifestyle. So you have a young Teddy Roosevelt who goes ranching and hunting in the Dakotas to cure his anxiety, his exhaustion after the death of his wife and mother. He later, of course, becomes president, but he also founds the Boone and Crockett Club. He encourages, young men to play rough and tumble sports. In the early 20th century, we also have the rise of Boy Scouts and 4-H clubs and fraternal orders with funny names like the Knights of Pythias and the Odd Fellows. They surge in popularity around this time, which is known as the golden age of fraternalism. And then there's this kind of pendulum that swings back and forth a few times throughout the rest of the 20th century. So after the Great Depression and world wars, we see American society decide instead to nurture damaged men who've come back from war and encourage that they have a more sedate sort of suburban lifestyle. And then you have threats again that come about through perceived threats, I should say, through gay liberation and feminism and greater workplace equality in the 70s and 80s. And we get this book by Robert Bly called Iron John in 1990, which calls for a return to a deep masculinity through wilderness retreats and Native American rituals that are sort of co-opted. And he idealizes this kind of mythopoetic man, which is in some ways a more complex and perhaps slightly healthier version of the alpha male ideal. So we see this throughout history. That's just the 20th century. It's not as if the alpha male concept is new, but it's interesting to see how it sort of twists and turns a little bit throughout the years.
So you alluded to this just a moment ago, but in recent years, I mean, many people have noted that American boys and men seem to be in crisis. If you look at, rates of death by suicide or boys and men losing ground to girls and women in educational attainment. Is there evidence, Charles, that alpha males are indeed happier or more successful than their peers who are not trying to be alphas?
No, but I mean, the premise of your question, we should be pretty clear that the alpha male concept is largely imagined, right? It's an aspirational ideal that doesn't actually exist in nature, as Frans de Waal showed with the chimps. Being the leader of a group is much more complex than our current concept of alpha male would have us believe. But we do know that there is a crisis among men and in masculinity right now. Just to list a couple of the things that Richard Reeves and others have made clear. Men's wages have decreased over the last 4 decades as a percentage of overall family income. Women now perform better than boys in high school. They're more likely to go to college, thus setting them up for better careers. Men are 5 times likelier than they were in the 90s to say they don't have any close friends. They're much less likely to receive mental health treatment than women. And I think they're 3 or maybe 4 times likelier to die by suicide. So there very clearly is a problem. And the idea of men coming together with other men to share their feelings of fear or anger, whatever it is they're going through, is not in and of itself damaging or bad by any means. In fact, it's probably good. But the sort of commercialization of these more crass versions of alpha male camps are where we get, I think, kind of a perverted version of the response to these problems.
Is there something about physical hardship that makes it easier for men, socialized as they are, to open up and do what feels hard emotionally for them?
I mean, I can speak from personal experience that when I've done rigorous exercise, climbed a mountain, done a long, lengthy bike ride, something like that, I feel calmer and more open in the minutes and hours after that. Um, and I don't know, I'm not a scientist. I don't know what's chemically happening exactly to my body. It's the same with sauna. I do a lot of regular sauna. I feel more open and vulnerable in that space when I'm sweating hard, when my body's kind of working aerobically. So just using my own personal experience, I'd say yes. There is something to that that's worth noting. It's just a question of what are we doing with and to men in those moments? Are we feeding them kind of toxic ideas, or are we encouraging them to share and open up, be vulnerable, console, do all the things that frankly are more associated with women?
That's a really interesting point because you make people vulnerable. On the one hand, maybe they can share and get support from other men, but they're also potentially vulnerable to taking in really toxic ideas about who they're supposed to be after the experience is over.
Yeah, susceptible maybe is the word I would
Yeah.
use. They're more susceptible, they're more open to all things, right? So that puts a lot more responsibility on the person who's guiding them through that. It's like I haven't myself done an ayahuasca ceremony, but those have also been popular in recent years in South America and elsewhere, when you drink this sort of hallucinogenic potion, and it's a lot of what you get out of that, as I understand it, has to do with who's guiding you through it, right? I mean, the drug itself matters, but so does the guide. So I don't know if that's a helpful metaphor or analogy, but I think it kind of makes sense to me.
Ayahuasca aside, I mean, some of the things that you've noted, climbing a mountain or even just getting in the sauna, like you can do those free or relatively inexpensively. These programs cost thousands of dollars for usually just a couple of days. Does everybody feel like they get their money's worth of alpha inspiration?
No, and even at Rise, which I think I've tried to describe as one of the better approaches to this broader kind of alpha camp phenomenon, one of the 10 guys that I met there got really upset. He'd been triggered too many times, been asked to roll around in too much mud and carry too many logs in his rucksack. He just decided suddenly he was done with it, and he demanded a ride from that rural wilderness location where they were doing the Rise camp back to his car in Charlottesville. And King obliged after trying to see if he could maybe change his mind. He ultimately refunded the money for this guy. The guy went back to Seattle, where he runs a karate studio. But I did run into this guy the day after he quit at the airport. We were both flying back to our homes, and he told me, like if I needed to be sprayed down with a hose and demeaned, I could have just asked my wife to do that to me, right? And he's like, well, he also said something that I think probably a lot of folks think when they hear about this stuff is, okay, yeah, of course, when you take the logs that you've been carrying for 2 hours out of your backpack and put them down, of course you're going to feel a weight's lifted off of you. It's not just a metaphorical weight; it's a real weight. And so he was very cynical and skeptical of the whole thing, which was, I mean, King thought unfortunate because he felt like up to that point he was seeing this guy start to do the work, start to open up. The guy did confess prior to his leaving the program to some pretty brutal child trauma and abuse that he'd gone through, and it seemed like that was maybe going to lead somewhere helpful. But nothing is for everyone, and this ultimately was not what this guy thought he needed.
I also found myself wondering, I mean, in our culture, we gender just a lot of things, including, people's trauma and pain and ennui. We imagine there's like a woman's version and a men's version. I mean, gender has obviously been complicated in recent years, but is it possible that what we're calling like, a men's problem and a men's solution might apply to lots of different people of various genders?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And I didn't have the space to include, um, as much feedback and insight from women as I would have liked to in this piece. But certainly, while there are some differences in our genders, this kind of idea, broadly speaking, of getting together with people of your gender, doing difficult things together, and then spending some time intimately away from devices, maybe in a wilderness or rural setting, maybe around a fire, opening up to one another about the hard stuff you go through and just listening and feeling a sense of community. I think that can go a long way for anybody. It doesn't matter what gender you are. That's just something we all need to do more of. And if we want to say that that's making us into more of an alpha, great. I don't, ultimately, the terminology is sort of beside the point. It's more about how can we feel more whole as people, and women, of course, deserve to pursue that in the ways that they think will help them.
I think most people, Charles, would say that encouraging masculinity among men is not inherently a bad idea. I mean, it depends how you define masculinity. But did you find that these programs broadly draw a hard and unforgiving line between what is masculine and therefore good for men and what is perceived to be like unacceptably feminine?
Yes. When I was at the Squire program, I listened to a guest lecturer, as he was described, who online is listed on his website as an ex-pastor turned sex coach, tell a bunch of mostly 14-year-old boys um, that they needed to be careful they didn't become fruitcakes, is that's the word that he and other coaches use there,
Mm.
and that they didn't emulate people like Harry Styles, the musician, pop star, who sort of does some gender bending things with how he dresses. These ideas of being anything remotely feminine was positioned as poisonous, and I thought that was just a very predictable but dangerous line to draw, because it's pretty clear that people don't fit neatly into traditional male and traditional female roles. There's a whole spectrum between, and there was this sort of blocking off of that spectrum that was being done at the Squire program. And there was also, they were name dropping. They name dropped a writer named Jack Donovan, who I'd never heard of, but who wrote a book called The Way of Men, and he describes in the book the qualities that make a man, and those are courage, bravery, and mastery, right? And that doesn't necessarily sound bad, but if you, as I did, go home, and I don't know how many of the boys did this, and Google Donovan, you'll learn pretty quickly that he also endorses white supremacy and doesn't think that women should have the right to vote. And so I think I want to give Julian the benefit of the doubt here, the guy, the founder of the program, that he didn't know this about Donovan, even though that's maybe hard to believe, and that he was just being a bit sloppy. But it goes to show that the sort of approach isn't as rigorous or careful or disciplined or thoughtful at some of these programs. Otherwise, I mean, I would have to assume that it's nefarious, and I don't want to think that about this guy, that he's actually trying to make white supremacists. I don't believe that.
Were you left with the impression, Charles, that the drive to turn men into alpha males is kind of a historical blip, or is this something that you think will remain with us into the future?
I think this is a sort of a course correction, is how the proponents would view it, from the sort of early pandemic period, where men were feeling really put upon and criticized for being men, and so they sort of swung the pendulum pretty far towards this hyper masculinity direction. And I think it's the pendulum's going to swing back. The pendulum's just going to keep doing what pendulums do. I don't know how long we'll be in this period, but it feels like this is a Trump-coded era and phenomenon that we're in, and perhaps we may see something different when that passes.
It's remarkable because some people thought that with Trump as president, men were back in fashion and nobody would have to fight for their sense of their own masculinity.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. I think that some of these guys who started these programs felt like, yes, we're now in a period where we have somebody at our back with a lot of power, but they still feel like there are these countervailing forces in the culture, the Harry Styles boogeyman, the Hollywood influences that Trump, much as he may wish he could, can't really control, or can't control to his satisfaction. So yeah, I think that there's always an enemy, and there's always a chance to make money.
Charles Bethea is a staff writer at The New Yorker, where you can read his article, "The Camps Promising to Turn You or Your Son into an Alpha Male." Charles, thanks very much for making time to talk.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. Thanks a lot.
Think is distributed by PRX, the Public Radio Exchange. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, anywhere you get podcasts, or at think.kera.org. Again, I'm Chris Boyd. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.